Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the September National Heritage Area Best Practices Zoom. I've kind of stopped calling it a call because it's more of a Zoom meeting now. So thank you all for tuning. This is part two of the conversation we started last time, talking about grant programs in national heritage areas. And due to the number of questions we had on the last call, this is going to be more of a question and answer session where we ask you guys, are anyone in the audience is welcome to answer a question. We have four different people who are willing to answer questions, but if you would like to answer the question and you're not one of these four people, please step up and say, oh, I can speak to that. This is more of a group conversation than it is actually like a presentation. So that's kind of how we're running it today. But the four people that have agreed to share with us or talk today and help answer questions is Benjamin Duvall-Irwin from Appalachian Forest National Heritage Area. Back this time is Danielle Walter-Davis, and she's from Baltimore National Heritage Area. Brian Yopp from MotorCities National Heritage Area, and Mackensie Wittmer from National Aviation National Heritage Area. And to get things going, I have a question, and this one's going to be for Ben. I'm sorry, Ben, to like call you out, but you of the four people on this call who have grant programs, I would consider you in like the newest member of this group. And I thought it would be good for you to share as a relatively newer heritage area, kind of Appalachian Forest process for starting the grant program and kind of give us a short kind of recap of what you have done so far in your grant program that might help spur other people to ask questions.
Yes, so we are relatively new. We were only designated in 2019, but our coordinating entity has been around for around 20 years. And, we're no strangers to grants as an organization. We've applied for plenty ourselves, have been a fiscal agent for several grants for other organizations. And so we knew going into our management planning process that grant program was something that we wanted to do and something that our stakeholders were interested in. And at the same time that we were going through our management plan process, we had our own grant from the Claude Worthington Benedum Foundation, which is a private foundation in West Virginia and Southwest Pennsylvania. This was funding a program that we were doing about tourism development for partners in our area. And part of that grant award to us was we wanted to use part of that grant money for mini grants to other partners in our area. So we had $60,000 of that private foundation money that was awarded to us that we wanted to put towards a mini grant program to promote tourism development, product development, events, accessibility improvements, things like that. And so we developed an application to cover the outputs that we were looking to cover for our grant funding. And we put together the application, put together a review committee, mostly made up of our board members. We wanted this to be an easily accessible application. The application was just for it was just up to $5,000 projects, 50% match, so nothing too fancy. We ended up awarding about 18 different projects. That started that application was due in 2021. It was going to be a 2-year grant period, so we just are now finishing up that mini grant program this summer. We're still finishing up some of the reporting for that. And so we wanted to use that as a kind of pilot program to figure out how we might want to run a bigger grant program once we got our higher tier funding as a National Heritage Area. And so we've taken the application for that smaller program and expanded that to include to relate to our management plan goals and themes. And so our grant program this year had a larger scope in what types of projects we were looking to fund, and a much bigger pool of money that we can award. And so we just finished up, we released our application for that program this summer. We had our applications due end of July. We just finished up our review process again by committee. We finished that up in August, and we just earlier this month have started dispersing the awards for that.
Well, thank you so much, Ben, for sharing. That's very exciting. I wish you well as you begin this, continue on this journey of granting. So we're going to open up to questions. I would say that if you'd like to type them in the chat and not unmute, that's perfectly fine, or you're more comfortable doing that, I can facilitate questions in the chat. But does anyone else have a question that they would like to ask? Just the group, and we can have our panelists decide if they want to try to answer it or not.
I have a question for Brian from Detroit, if I may. First time caller, long time listener. Mackensie, your grant program, and I've always found it unique because the structure, as I understood it, is that you have a set of partners that you work with and grant to, directly. It's almost predetermined, as opposed to like maybe the competitive application and revolving grant program. So what have you found to be sort of the pros to that and the cons to that? Because it's an interesting concept.
Sure. Thanks for asking. What I will say that our grant guidelines are written in such a way that an organization that is not a designated partner could apply. It's written in such a way, and I don't have the language right in front of me, but it's a designated aviation heritage partner as defined as such, or an organization working with one of those partners advancing aviation heritage. I think that the pros are that what immediately comes to mind is I know all of these partners really well. So in terms of like risk assessments, I know who is higher risk, and I think I shared last call that I have one partner who would be on reimbursement only just because they're more high risk. And I think another pro is that we encourage them to work together, and they know each other as well. We're only talking about an 8-county region. So I think that it uniquely works because we are 8 counties. Pretty much all the 501c3s that are doing aviation heritage are identified as designated partners. But I think a con would be that we're not using our grant program to build the heritage areas network, if that makes sense. So like I'm not traditionally doing projects with parks or city governments, which might strengthen the portfolio of the heritage area. We're not typically doing that. What immediately came to your mind, Brian, when you were thinking about your question?
Brian, you're still muted.
I was still muted. You're right. You would think I'd be an old pro by now. But there was this existential question about partnership and what that means, and I was intrigued by the idea of simply, it would feel like an incentive even, and a way to fully integrate with our partners if they knew that every year there was sort of a guaranteed stipend of money or a grant that was coming, the project changes, but the opportunity is still there every year. So in a way, it intrigued us to say, what if instead of it being this free for all, which gives you the variety, and it's very interesting, and there's never a dull moment in that. But if it were like museum A, B, C, and D, you're on our list. What do you have going on this year? Can we approve it or not approve it? And maybe that's like the first pass, and then maybe it goes out competitively. There's another like thought with that says, okay, we focus on our primary partners, and then we figure out if there's the leftover grant money, it goes out to the competitive field. But we're seeding, the sites and the partners that we work with most closely, because we have that issue of they're hot when they're hot, and they're cold when they're cold. We have programs that are like perennial. Hey, every year we've got something new, something different. Here's the next exhibit or the next speakers bureau, and we're right on the list. And then we have some that, we installed a mural 10 years ago, and then we don't hear from them until, hey, the paint's fading on that mural. We need another grant to replace the mural. So what have you been doing in the last 10 years? And could we have been more helpful in that? So it's just one of those questions. We are going through the exciting process of strategic planning and reimagining, so to speak. And we're also in our 25th year. So there's a lot of like, what's the meaning of life sort of things going on. And that's one of these questions that we're asking about is how could we be more effectively rooted with our partners so that they see us in the value directly, consistently, every year, all the time, not just when they need us, not just when we need them.
Ryan, I'd be happy to talk with you more about and share our paperwork and such. If you explore that a little bit more, I will say that some of the comments you made make a lot of sense to me in the sense of, to have a non-competitive grant process kind of keeps them at the table, right? And because that grant agreement requires certain recognition, certain levels of partnership or significant involvement, it furthers the relationship, right? And so these are also the partners that I'm doing other aspects of the heritage area work with. And I think it also works because we have a very defined theme. I'm jealous of many people on this screen who have multiple interpretive themes and can talk about everything from nature to indigenous peoples to, movements in American history. We're very, very defined. So we also don't necessarily have a lot of other organizations trying to do this work, if that makes sense.
I mean, it's good to fill a unique niche, so that's important, right? That there's not somebody else competing with you, and we don't have that either. So I think that's a value add to our situation. One more question to grease the wheels here is for Danielle. So when we met in DC, like my spirit animal as far as the work that you do, and for those who weren't on the last call, Danielle's juggling, right? State grants, city grants, MPS. So you've got all this going on. How much do you have to adhere to the National Park Service? Everybody's, fiscal year is ending 9/30. Are there projects and grants that have to fit into that, or how do you deal with like that overlap and spillover and managing the grants over multiple federal fiscal years? Or do you?
Thanks, Brian. I hope I can answer this question clearly. So there's a lot to juggle here at Baltimore in terms of having basically 3 different parent funders. So we have to be very organized in terms of our deadlines for federal, state, and city. So there is, unfortunately, a lot of administrative work here, and we're a bit stretched staff-wise because it's a lot of work. But I think what's important to note is once you have your calendar in place with all the different deadlines, we take a step back, and Shantae has a lot of amazing ideas. We do as a team and what we want our grant program to be. How do we meet the needs of Baltimore? And how do we sync that with our parent funders? So there's a lot of matchmaking that happens at our office with the requirements by our funders and then what the needs are in Baltimore. And then we have to come somewhere in between. So my advice to anybody starting a grant program is before we do any guidelines or assess the needs of our communities, we look at what our parent funders' parameters are, and we make sure we're hitting all those deadlines, all those reports. and we look very closely at the grant agreements, what is eligible, what's not. Once we have that in place, it's sort of a phase one, then we go to a phase two. Okay, now let's look at Baltimore. What are our needs? What can we do? And we match that. And we expanded it as much as we can, and we try to have the best relationships with our parent funders as possible. And we challenge our funders. For example, our city government and the state, the match was a very big barrier for many of our partners here in Baltimore. We understand the reasoning behind the match to encourage economic development, buy-in by different funders, private investment. But we were also facing the fact that many partners weren't coming to the table for grants because they struggled with that. So we went to our city government and our state and said, is there any way we can redefine the match? And it was very interesting because we thought that there would be a lot of resistance. No, you can't do it. But everybody came to the table and had discussion. And we have been able to convince the state and city not to relax the match, but to come down on the in-kind percentage. And that has helped a lot of our partners. So I think for us in Baltimore, it's a very fine dance between multiple parent funders, federal, city, and state. And it's very much of a matching process between their rules and guidelines and eligible activities and what our needs are. I hope that sort of clarifies.
Oh, well, it's like you should get off this call right now because you don't have the time to be talking to us. You got to be managing and juggling, so it's a lot within that. So I was curious about that.
Oh, thanks, Brian. It is, I think that's why Baltimore created the position that I'm in, is because it is very heavy on administrative compliance. But it's worth it. And I think we yield some great returns, ultimately helping our partners. But it is something to think about if you have multiple funding partners, because the back end admin work is heavy.
Liz was asking because she wasn't on that. You shared the map last time to show that overlap of the investment zones and areas, and it's really really impressive. Should I read this, Heather? The question.
I mean, I think you might go ahead and facilitate the call, Brian. I'm totally cool with that. So
No. I saw a question. I didn't want to.
I'm also happy to come on and ask my own question if that's easier.
All right, I'll save my voice.
Thanks, Brian. I'm Alex. I'm from Maritime, Washington. We are setting up a new grant program, like our first grant program, and we're planning to pass through some of our funding for NPS. And I'm wondering, for folks that have been doing that, what materials, information, documentation are you requesting from your grantees once they complete their projects? We want to make sure that we're like in compliance, doing what we need to with NPS without overwhelming our grantees with paperwork, because a lot of them are very small organizations, some mostly volunteer run. Thanks.
And do you want to? Should I?
I think we do it a little differently, Brian. So why don't, because you do yours as a reimbursement, correct?
Right. Yeah. So probably the best way to explain it is to go from the beginning to, you're already after the grant, so after the project's done, but I would start from the beginning with the application. And, we're doing things like, clarifying nonprofit status and tax ID, making sure all that stuff is uploaded and implemented on our entire grant application is online, and they can input all of this information about their project, the relevant stuff. But then we ask them to attach things like their IRS determination letter, list of board members, the budget, other supplemental materials, so that all that stuff is there, not just for the grant review, but sort of as a nice little handy package, as you go through the entire process. So it's not just it's what you presented at the beginning, it's what you say you're going to do throughout the project. We can always go back to that as a reference. So I would encourage to kind of collect that in a systematic way so that it's not scattered anywhere. It's kind of in one place, and especially depending on what your grant review process is, you want everybody to sort of have access to it generally in the same way. Then throughout, it kind of depends on the project. I mean, I'll say that there are projects that are heavy in volunteerism, and that's one of the biggest things that people have looked over when they're starting to collect, is they get eyeballs deep into it. They say, oh, we've been working 1,000 hours here in the last few months, should we have tracked that? Yeah. So we give them, here's a form that you can fill out that's volunteer signs in, time out, number of hours, and give them perspective of what it equates to. I forget what's $27, $28 an hour or something like that. So it's a pretty big number. So that's one thing. And then all the receipts and invoices and other things that were related to the direct costs. Because we're reimbursement, we award them, say, $20,000. They start their project, they can start submitting receipts back to us, immediately. So I'll get a little package that says, here's a cover sheet for what we did. Here are the receipts that are attached to this for your review, for your submission. So we'll do it like that. It encourages them, of course, to be organized and to separate these things, to make sure they're clear on what we're funding, what we're not funding. All that is tied into the budget. So we will know whether you're trying to slip in receipts for Jimmy John subs or whether it's like, here's the thing we said we were going to pay for. So all that is tracked throughout. And then at the end, once the project's done, we have them complete a partnership survey. So, hey, how was the project? How great was it to work with MotorCities? Check all these boxes. And then we also have them complete sort of an analysis of the original expectations of the grant. How well do you think you fulfilled this? Give us the examples. So we would ask them, hey, submit the photos of the work that you completed and all this stuff. So that way it all, again, comes back to us in one package. So I would say you track it that way from the beginning of the process all the way through. So that way at the end, you've got a nice little package and you're done. Hopefully. Then you start the fun stuff part of reporting that all to NPS.
Brian, does it sounds like you guys do midway reimbursements on the project, is that, or do you just collect receipts throughout?
It's ongoing. I mean, most of the times we know our grant people, if anybody else does reimbursement, they do it at the end. And they're pretty much programmed to operate like that. They like to do one big bundle, turn it all in at the end. But there are some folks who say, we spent $10, we want our $10 back. And so when they send their reimbursement in, we say we'll do it up to once a month, because that way it doesn't become crazy for us. But it makes it so that there's not a financial burden on them. If they do indeed need their $10 back, then hey, we've got the means that we can process it through and support it throughout. So if they need a reimbursement and they need to send it in, we accept it once a month of the grant period. We try to award for 1 year. So that keeps us sort of focused. That's why I asked that question to Danielle about the overlap, because that keeps us focused on who do we owe, who could potentially come through at this most wonderful time of the year at 9:30, who is still out there that maybe hasn't finished up a grant, that we say, hey, are you going to do it? Do you need an extension, or are we cutting you off? At least we have a nice little window of time, but everybody doesn't do it that way.
Go ahead, Justin.
I was just going to say, we track it very similarly to MotorCities. We have a final report template that has the volunteer hours, has also the other partners, the other funding entities, and they have to put who they are, if the source is, nonprofit, state, federal, local, whatever, all the different funding sources are. They have to list those out, list the amounts out. That helps us track, from our perspective, what our match is, what our leverage funds are. And then it also helps us identify what other potential partners are for similar type projects in the future. Caroline's on here. She's the one that's created all these templates. Alex, if you want to see an example of what our final report template looks like, I'll shoot one over to you.
That would be awesome. Thank you.
I was just going to add that when National Aviation moves into a more robust, competitive, larger grant function, I think it would work more like Brian and Justin have described. But as we have a small 75,000, 5,000 per partner non-competitive grant program, I shared last month, and I'll share it again real quick, how we guarantee that match. All of the match that we do goes on, it must adhere to general accepted accounting practices. So if a partner is making their match with new donor money, those donors give directly to NHA, earmarked for that grant project. So 5 air camp donors give $1,000 to NHA earmarked for their grant. Then NHA matches with 5,000 and issues that check to air camp for 10,000. Now they're still doing all the forms and the outcomes and the final reports. But I know that money is, and that also makes it federal money. Remember, the entire amount becomes federal money in that process. The second way is if I have a partner who needs to use part of their capital reserves to do a project, they can give me the balance of the invoice and I will pay the vendor directly. So in this middle column, you'll see that I had a partner, Dayton History. They were doing a 20,000 landscaping project around the Wright Brothers National Museum. And so they issued 15,000 to NHA. We matched it with our 5 and we paid the vendor, which was the landscaper, $20,000. So that's another way of, you know, guaranteeing that they're using that money for what they said they're going to do. Probably the riskiest is this third column, which is in kind and volunteer hours. I think that's the riskiest for all of us because they could lie, right? We have to trust them. We have to ask them, you know, they have to sign their name to their forms, certifying that it's accurate. But volunteers who receive money to do projects and are using volunteer hours or using those volunteer timesheets and signing off and compiling those hours. I'm a big fan of having people have their match flow through NHA because it's a way of me knowing that it's actually happening.
Okay, I have a follow-up question, and anybody who has a grant program is welcome to answer this question. So how do you ensure that the project that you're funding is tied in some way to your themes and to what the goals of what you as a national heritage area are trying to accomplish? So I'm assuming nobody's just funding something that's so far outside of their heritage area purview because that just would be a little weird. So could someone explain, like, is it part of the application process? Like, how do you ensure that your money is being spent in a way that, you know, helps connect to the heritage areas?
So this is Christy with Cole Heritage. It's part of the application process. We put all of our interpretive themes and really kind of spell them out from our management plan. And so one of the questions is tell us how your project connects, which interpretive theme does it connect to, and how does it connect? And unlike aviation, we've got about 6 interpretive themes, so it's pretty broad. We can put lots of things under that, but it also gets those folks thinking about, you know, is this the right grant for me if I can't connect it to the interpretive theme? So that's the way we do it, and that's part of the scoring. When we score them, you know, how many, it's 10 points for connection to interpretive themes, and you know, they get 1 through 10 points for how well they did that. So
yep, similar. We started off with that from the beginning of the application, and then the scoring is based on how well they meet the themes of automotive, heritage tourism, education interpretation, and revitalization. So, and then we actually have our grant review committee is comprised of a state level expert on each one of those topics. So we have our state SHPO, we have our preservation officers there, we have the Michigan State University for Education, we have a labor specialist actually just to put that labor piece into it, and then we have someone from our Michigan Museums Association there for education. So they are looking at it that way and making sure that it fits, you know, passes their muster. Then they're a nice cohesive unit that kind of passes it all the way through to when it finally gets approved.
Thank you, everyone. Okay, we had another question in the chat, and I think this is open to anybody, but it says, does anyone here forego requiring match, and what does that look like?
I can speak to this one, but I want to start a little bit back from the grant program. Remember, the Midwest region does things a little differently than the other regions as of FY23, TBD in FY24. But as of right now, we work under a cooperative agreement. Currently, NHA is working under a 5-year cooperative agreement. And then each year that agreement has a modification, which allows for next year's money. So as we're reporting through Grant Solutions, By the end of that cooperative agreement, so let's see, 5 years, so $2.5 million, okay? By the end of 5 years, when I have to close out that cooperative agreement, I need to have all 2.5 million spent and all 2.5 million deliverables obligated or in hand by closeout, unless I go for a no-cost extension. Let's not get into the weeds about that. Okay, so if I have overmatched in the first few years of my cooperative agreement, I could forego requiring match on my grant program. Not National Aviation is currently pacing ahead of our federal dollars. I won't speak for Illinois and Michigan, but I remember as she was closing out a cooperative agreement, Anna didn't have to do any match for last year because she had overmatched so much that she did not need to do match that last year. That might not apply to your region. You need to work with your regional coordinator to make sure you understand how they are interpreting what you need to do for your match. So going back, I would say to the person who asked about foregoing match, I would say there's pros and cons to that, right? You might have partners where match is an obstacle and you would really like to help them advance their projects. NHA has chosen not to forego match because I don't want my partners to get out of practice of doing match, because when I start a new cooperative agreement in FY26, I need them to match.
Would other people like to add in, like weigh in on that? I think it's a very interesting question.
Yeah, it's one of those things that if you can do it and you feel like it works for your situation, go for it. But for the reasons Mackensie just said, I don't see it happening that way. Motor City started granting 2001, our management plan was approved. 2002, we started granting. So we've been granting the entire time, essentially. And there was a short period of time when we didn't require a match, but we weren't using Park Service funds. We were using private donors in Mackenzie's previous example where it would flow through us. I find that the skin in the game discussion with our donors is the key. I mean, with our partners is the key to that, because if they don't feel like they have to invest in it, then they're really, not as. And then the whole thing of, it's a complicated formula, but the whole thing about having the grand total of match to fulfill your cooperative agreement, I would encourage that. So you collect it as much as you can, because there may come a rainy day. The timing of MotorCities' end of our recent cooperative agreement came in 2021, when we had just gone through, or we're still going through, right, 2020. And we were so thankful that the squirrel away of match was there to help us out. So you just never know with that. So I would say you want to probably capture it as much as you can, plus the volunteer hours and all the other stuff that comes along with that you want to get in the practice of doing. And I think it helps them grow. These small organizations, like Alex said, if they're very small organization, I think this is good training for them, because none of these grant programs seem like overly stringent. We're not breaking their backs doing this, but it helps them grow as far as knowing how to do this stuff.
Okay, I do think the skin in the game part is important, because it helps keep your partners invested in what you're doing. So our next question is, how is your organization helping to grow the ability of your grantees to grow capacity? Is that an aspect of your grant programs? And Danielle, you haven't said anything for a while and you're nodding your head, so I'm just going to call you out to answer this one, and we'll see if we have other people that can add into that, but you were nodding your head, so.
Thanks, Heather. So this is a big issue, not issue, but a challenge and an opportunity in Baltimore. We work with many partners who are small partners, and they all have capacity issues. So with our Heritage Investment Grant Program, which is our MPS funded mini grant program, we have a category for operating and capacity building, along with a lot of other eligible project types. And we have found that we have a lot of partners coming to us for operating. They are not allowed to come to us back to back for operating, but we find they come back in like the second or third year again. So we have worked with, I wouldn't say we prospected, but we have some fantastic small organizations. They're amazing, but they struggle with capacity and they're not, in our eyes, doing anything to help with their capacity. So we have gone out and talked to them about, please come in for a capacity building grant. We're not going to tell you what to do, but we think this will help you be sustainable. And we've had a few organizations, upon our urging of them to apply, that have come in for capacity building. Most of them come in for fund development help. And it's a little too early to tell, but within the last 2 years, 3 years, we've seen some improvement. But there's a lot of technical assistance that comes with that. So I think through the mini grant program, if you can offer capacity building grants, it is really a game changer in terms of building their capacity, mostly in fund development, which helps with their sustainability. And then they can get more funds from other organizations that allows them to either hire a fund development consultant or an operations person that can manage that grants management. So we have found some success with that if your grant programs allow for capacity building. And we also find that a lot of our partners don't know the difference between operating support and capacity building. So we try to be as clear as possible in our guidelines, as well as one-on-one consultations, to say operating support is keeping the lights on, paying the rent, paying for that executive director to keep the doors open to the public. Capacity building is, and we put this in our grant application. Can you tell us how this one-time investment will launch your sustainability for the next 2 or 3 years? And what efforts will you put in place to sustain that? And it's a tough bill to come up with that answer, but it makes our partners think about it. And so far it's been successful.
I'd like to build on what Danielle said. I think that I really appreciate what she said, but I caution the people to remember that she has different pots of money and that you cannot use federal dollars for fundraising. So we're pretty stringent that in our grant program, we would not pay for fund development personnel or fundraising materials or even marketing materials that go to support a capital campaign. You know, all that CFR 200 applies to your grants. So if you're using your federal dollars to make grants, you need to be pretty careful about what costs you're approving.
Right. And Danielle, we have a follow-up question for you. The question is, do you provide capacity building services in-house, or do you retain outside contract support to provide these services?
Thank you for that question. We just did a survey to all of our grantees and our partners this past summer. And one of the biggest areas of needing support for our partners was technical assistance. So right now, every time we do a grant cycle, we provide information sessions. I do one-on-one consultation as much as possible, but our partners are needing more. So we are talking about internally, perhaps not this year, but next year, to come up with like a grants institute where we can put on our website resources, link them to consultants, where we don't necessarily provide that support, but we're the link to other people that can provide that support. And in Baltimore, there are a fair amount of free resources. For example, Towson University is having some of their undergraduate students who are interested in doing civic work, public service when they graduate. And they provide free grant services to nonprofits under a certain organizational budget. So we wouldn't necessarily provide grant services for them, but we would link them to maybe Towson University, and they can seek that out on their own. We just don't have the capacity in-house to provide that type of support, but we're talking about formally coming up with a grants institute or a portal of some sort that would link the resources in the community to our partners. But it's still under development.
And then to follow up on that again, so a portion of your grants are made available for technical assistance. Am I understanding that correctly?
That is true.
And you use those, you award those grants to your grantees for the purposes of applying those funds to a third party outside contractor who can support their specific need.
That is correct.
Okay.
That is correct. Our grant programs are 2-year grant programs. And we have probably a list of 10 to 12 eligible type projects. And within that, I wouldn't necessarily call it technical assistance, but we do operating support. We also do capacity building. But if they get those grants, they can go out and hire a contractor or a consultant to help them.
Oh, so you allow them to select their own contractors for these rather than provide them or have a.
Correct.
Okay.
But it's part of their application.
Right.
And our third party grant review committee looks very closely at who they are potentially going to hire. They're required to put that resume on there, how a timeline, what do they think their deliverables will be at the end of this contract. We keep a very flexible but tight eye on this because we want this to be an investment that works for them. So that is part of the selection process. They really do have to do their homework, select a potential consultant, and that's looked at by our review committee, and that's part of their decision making.
Great. Now, sorry to sidetrack, but the grant review process, which we've, our first round of grants 2 years ago was pretty light. This last one we had, I think, almost 40 applicants and for twice as much money. And we were using our board primarily and a couple of staff members.
No, don't do that.
Yeah, that's where I'm starting to go. Because it was onerous and there was a lot of pushback.
Mm-hmm.
What does everyone do? I mean, are there third party grant review organizations, or do you just put together a retinue of grant reviewers do you pay them? Is there some way to incentivize them so that, what does everyone do for that?
And related to that, if you have different people reviewing and scoring different grants, then how do you adjust for scoring bias?
Well, like I mentioned earlier, we put together a committee that we hope represents the three, legs of our stool, our mission area, but they are not board members. They are state level leaders in those particular areas. And then we do have a board member on that committee, and I also facilitate the discussion. So that's more for information. That's more for alignment with board strategies and just making sure everybody's clear on it. But we kind of keep them in this isolation, like, okay, you look at the grants independent of the influence of our board, and that way, when they have the review, it is unbiased. Because I think the challenge of having the board members include, especially with us, because we have some of these nonprofit grant applicants on our board, and then that would skew quite a bit of it if they are voting for themselves or mixing it up. So that's how we do it. We don't pay them in sandwiches, I guess, but not even that.
Yeah, I mean, we did institute a fairly straightforward conflict of interest disclosure for our board members and the committee members that participated in the grant reviews. We had a few that disclosed too close of a relationship to the grantees, but yeah, trying to find those people that are willing to spend multiple hours during grant reviews is challenging.
We might have to offer them sandwiches, Logan. I mean,
yeah, make better sandwiches.
They had to at least get them sandwiches.
I just wanted to quickly add about the grant review committee. It sounds like we have we're very similar to Brian's third party committee. We have a committee of about 10 third party external grant reviewers, and they do review 3 different grant programs throughout the year, and it is a heavy lift. We have about a third city government, a third education, tourism, and then a third previous grantees, community level people. And we are now working on different levels of terms. So some of them have 3-year terms, the community folks have 1-year terms, but we have just instituted one board member that is on there, which is a very nice link to our board of directors. So the board member does review and score, but it's the link to the board of directors, which has so far worked out pretty well. I don't know about different regions, but in our region, it's becoming very common practice to do a public call for a review committee, but that is extremely time intensive. But we are just recently adding in a stipend. Most of our reviewers don't accept it because they're government, but they can accept $100 per review. And we only did that is because in our region, most grant reviewers now receive a stipend, but we find that people want to be on the grant review committee because it's they like to see how the sausage is made. They want to be an influential person, but we are also considering bias training because after you've been reviewing a while, everybody has biases, and for all of us to kind of keep ourselves in check with the scorecard. So that's something we are exploring this next year, to understand what bias means and to provide that training for our review committee.
Yeah, and it's not always bias for or against content, but just in how they view things. You know, if you're using a 5-point Likert scale, some people will rate most things a 4 or 5, and others think 3 is perfectly good. You have to be really exceptional to get better than 3. And if you have some people rating different people rating different applications, then that doesn't come out to an even average, right? I'm not saying that very well, but
No.
yeah.
That's definitely an excellent point, Phyllis. And I think it's important to recognize that our scorecard is actually very basic, because if you do a very tight scorecard, that's not helpful either. So you're always finding the balance between having enough flexibility for opinion as well as trying to be objective with your scorecard. There will always be bias, but just keeping that in check, that everybody is kind of scoring based on the same principles and how to move your organization forward.
Yeah.
But I don't think there is an exact formula. I think everybody's different, and it's always a fine dance.
Sabrina, you have a question or a comment?
A comment, and it could totally be out of left field, because I took a call from Alex, our NPS regional manager, and I'm coming back into the conversation. But on this idea of scorecards, we are opening our cycle again this month, and we have taken a new approach with the scoring. To get to what Phyllis was just saying about subjective rating scales, and I'll be able to share a little bit better after we get through this round and see how our board responded to this. But we set up our rating card with 2 different areas. This first part is ratings, and for the 1 to 5, we made it really clear, what does 1 look like? 1 for public benefit means that this is only going to hit a very small niche or a few people, and then a 5 would be, this is really community wide. This is going to cover all 5 of the areas within our heritage area. Like, we help them to scale what that 1 to 5 would look like. And then on the second part, there is an open-ended question asking the board members to consider then how they feel this aligns with the management plan. I think there's some ranking with our interpretive plans, but it will be interesting to see how our review committee then responds to such well-scripted ranking systems. It could completely backfire in my face, or it might really help us be very aligned. So Phyllis, I'm glad you brought up that point, because Danielle's right. Like, the rating cards are really helpful. And you've got to get that balance between a quantitative scorecard, but also that qualitative like feel for the grant. And yeah, so use that for what it's worth.
Let us know how that works.
A couple people posted comments
Sorry.
how they assemble the review committee in the chat. And Alex, do you have a question? Because we have another one in the chat. So.
Oh, no, I was actually just going to note to Phyllis, I've participated in grant review committees before where there was like 100 grant applications. So not every reviewer read every one. And what they had us do instead of scoring them was we ranked them. So it was, we ranked them like, like 1 to 10. And I don't know how they did that on the back end, but that might like help account for folks who just like their version of what a 5 is different from each other.
Okay, good.
All right. So as I mentioned, there are a couple different, actually, I think Brian just had one that just kind of explains how they picked who the committee was and those types of things. So definitely look at the chat. Our next question is, does your NHA regional coordinator participate in your grant review process? Mackenzie shaking her head no.
No, ours is not. I have met with our regional coordinator, financial assistance, and even WASO staff when I've had a specific question around compliance.
Just real quick, we don't have our our regional coordinator part of our grants committee, but we do have NPS representation by Fort McHenry. So I know that's not applicable to a lot of organizations, but it's a little different model maybe, but we do have NPS on there.
Yeah, and I think Elizabeth responded in the chat about it too. Yes, Brian?
No, I'll say we bring them in, like Mackenzie said, sort of there's a question or some issue that really needs to be clarified, but they're not, not a formal part of the review.
All right, and there's lots of great information in the chat. So I would recommend that you save the chat before we end the call today so you can capture all this great information. We are running down on time. We have like 5 minutes left. So as we're winding down, are there other questions or thoughts that people would like to share about grant programs? This has been, in my opinion, it's been a very successful call. We've had lots of discussion. Does anyone else, I should say, have a question?
I have a fairly large question, which may be a whole different discussion, but how do you handle construction projects? If you want to do historic preservation construction, if you want to do new parts to parks or whatever, what counts as construction? What do we have to do differently? How do we report it? What it's a whole big thing, and we just avoided it this time. But
yeah.
At some point we may want to go there. And
good night, everybody.
Yeah.
So
does anybody do construction projects?
And that call is on the YouTube channel. It was discussed, but I think because for the sake of time, it was discussed last time. And jump on if they want, but I think the general consensus was nobody touched it because it got way too complicated because of the federal funds attached to it.
Really
am I wrong, Danielle? Mackenzie, you guys were on last time, and I feel like that was the consensus. And I don't, because we're short on time. Like I feel like that was the consensus. Correct.
Correct. Our construction projects that are funded are only through city and the state. All our NPS money is only non-capital for that very reason.
Yeah, well, and the other problem is trying to define construction, because we all know this 2 CFR 200 description is about as vague as they get. So we've just been new use.
I'll cop to the fact that in the preservation field, the spirit of revitalization and rehabilitation, we do support projects that include we replace roofs, we fix foundations. So we dally into that, but it's only when it's necessary and we find it critically important. We don't let people build new museums. We don't let people construct new gazebos and things like that. It's more about the shoring up, Section 106 compliance, shoring up of the historic property. And then we wade into that water, but very select.
From what I can understand from the construction definition, that remediation of problems of existing structures and existing materials in the form that they are in without modifying them too heavily, that doesn't fall under construction. It's or even major renovation, because you're not creating a new use or an adaptive reuse of space. But
Yeah.
that's been my reading of it. But
an example is that we, for multiple years, where some of you who came to Detroit when we hosted the NHA conference, saw the plot of land that ultimately became a park that we dedicated to a labor march that happened in Detroit. And we didn't use any of the money, $1.2 million that was raised for that. We didn't use any of that related to MPS because it was construction, because it was like, you're flattening this piece of land, you're installing all this stuff, you even, the sculptures and the signage and everything. We just left it off, and it felt like a lost opportunity because we raised $1 million for it, but it was just too complicated to talk about building something and tying it to the Park Service. So we did. Project was great, but we left the construction part out of it.
And remember, if you need to talk to your regional coordinator in your financial assistance office if you're going to do grants that are construction, because when you do your package for your cooperative agreement, you're probably signing a 424B, which is a non-construction projects form. So you need to do the 424D, I think. Double check me on that. But because if you're granting federal dollars for construction projects, you need to work with your team on that to make sure you're compliant.
I understood that we would have to do it if we were to go halfway through an agreement, cooperative agreement period, and decide to do a construction project, we'd have to go back and do a modification and get written permission to do that. So that's why we're trying to stay out of it.
Yeah, and I will mention for those of you who were not able to join us last month that we did do the first part of the grant is conversation is on recorded and online for those people who would like to go back.
Right. Thank you.
Listen to it. And then Liz has a comment. She said that hoping a nationwide programmatic agreement on Section 106 will help everyone feel more comfortable doing construction subgrants or your own construction bricks and mortar. We are basically at time. I would like to thank all of our well, they're not really our committee, our group of people who spoke about grants, and for all those people who spoke up that were not officially on the official panel. Thank you so much for participation. This has been one of my favorite best practice calls because we were sharing and talking amongst ourselves. So thank you all for tuning in today. I would highly recommend saving the chat because it has lots of great information in it. So everyone have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye.